Hi, everyone. Thanks for attending on a Thursday afternoon. My name is Sanjay Kumar from Cloudera. I run our communications, media, and utilities business. My colleague, Mike Gurr, please say hi. Mike.
Hello, guys.
Okay.
I'm a general manager from manufacturing and automotive here at Cloudera.
Okay. And what we're going to talk about today is we were going to talk about the concept of connected communities, especially in light of connected cars, smart city, and the ability to kind of share data across multiple ecosystems. So to do it, we took a certain flavor. We took a connected car with Smart City Initiative as a model to try to define how this can work, what the business value is around. And we'll talk about what some of the models that get generated out of there. We'll also start showing about what it means from an architectural perspective and some of the technology that enables you to make that happen right now. And again, we'd love to have kind of a question and answer period at the end. So love to get your thoughts on how that is. So maybe to set the stage, when we talk about the connected world, I mean, this is something you guys know well. There's been an explosion in information. When we look at what it means from the automotive industry, there has been an explosion of the types of information that's coming in and the nature of where it comes. But what's been interesting, as you start looking at what that growth pattern is, although there's an expectation of growth in the traditional OEM models for the vehicle and the aftermarket, the real opportunity is in that new recurring revenue with shared mobile and the connected ecosystem. And of the connected world communities, this is an area where the automotive industry has been very aggressively moving forward. But when you look at what that means, you find that everyone's been developing things on their own silo aspect. And so we kind of talk about really, how do you start achieving those type of growths in a more meaningful manner? So that's kind of when we talk about how to drive this. We're going to see that it's really the connectivity across industries as an ecosystem. So as we look at that in that connected community, we see models where, in many cases, the automotive industry is helping drive that, with a lot of the carriers being the facilitators for a lot of these solutions, leveraging the network in a model. But it really creates these ecosystems or multiple ecosystems where it has the impact from the insurance industry on the ability to make data-driven decisions, in many cases without the liability of owning the data along there. It has a huge impact when we talk about the retail industry, having more of that dynamic interaction with close proximity to large audiences, being able to understand movement and growth and have that plugged into the spending patterns. We see a huge synergy around smart cities when we look at the growth. Now, again, smart cities, it's an initiative many have done, still trying to figure out what the revenue models associated are. But as you start looking, you start seeing that there is a big impact on their infrastructure and management, but in many cases, it's also a key component to being able to develop merchant hubs as revenue streams around there. We also see kind of that extended ecosystem that's going to the service providers as they participate in the aftermarket arena for automotive, in the energy sector, being able to tap in the utilization of energy in this type of ecosystem, and really the other ecosystem around home and work. And as you start combining connected car with smart city with smart home and work, you start getting into a very different environment of the need to interact, especially as they're being developed on separate life cycles. So with that, we start talking about the idea of a connected community. So what is a connected community? Right? We see it's a group of parties that really see the ability to share data, not just from one source, but from multiple sources, across line of business, across geographies. They're really connected by data. It's a really fundamental aspect of not getting caught up in what the underlying infrastructures are between the entities, but using data as the decoupling mechanism to interact across those. And really a membership by need across different communities, being able to take models where it's, when you talk about connected car, the interaction with connected car, with smart city, with the tourism models, with the merchants, with that whole ecosystem. And we're looking at, we're talking about models that have both a key real-time aspect in the traditional IoT types of models, as well as the aggregation of that data in that extended ecosystem. So this idea of a connected community, having multiple parties that may share data, there's a different type of need. And so as we look around, give an example of what that connected community may be for the automotive industry. If we look at the top, we see many of the key participants in that ecosystem: the connected car with the device, the auto manufacturers, the OEMs themselves, their dealers, and their suppliers. And that's the traditional model that's been there. But you really see a lot of the value coming as you start tapping into, how the insurance companies tap into that model, how it interacts with smart city, how researchers and governments tap into that for meaningful points of action, and the home, the energy, the gas, really off this model where there really is multiple parties that are providing data, but they want to be able to provide the data in a controlled manner where they can dictate who gets to see their data and the life cycle of the data, how long it exists in that system, and opening up to an ecosystem that's really wanting to tap into the data, but not necessarily in raw form, but really the insights associated to the data. And in many cases, based on the needs and the relevance of their role in that. We see this as really, in many cases, what the future will be in future commerce models, where it's not driven by one company. Even though it may be started in that way, it's really that ecosystem of multiple parties that are in both the business and consumer sides as you start getting into that model. When we see that, really the key drivers become what is the business value. And we're seeing variations on what the business values are, from the data monetization models to real-time operational models to new models for commerce and trade, and areas around supply chain and data exchange. And this is by no means an all-inclusive model, but it helps identify, when we talk about what these new ecosystems are, where some of the opportunities are. And we've taken it in the flavor of both the connected car and the smart city to kind of give you an idea of what it would be across the different venues. But if I take a look at that and start looking at what are some of the use cases that kind of get formed, we're going to, as an example of data monetization, right? It is areas, in this example, we look at smart cities and have models that may be a consumer registration, as well as kind of, a few different sources of information, assuming there's an opt-in for those models, but it actually allows, scenarios with the automotive industry, for example, to have insights into the drivers, the consumers, the residential demographics for target marketing. We see the things around insurance for citizen demographics and movement and patterns for automotive, life, corporate insurance. And again, without the spin of having to own the data, but just understand the insights associated to it. And a big component around retail. And when you start applying demographics of driving close to retail locations as target marketing, as examples. We see, when we look at those real-time operational models, and for the connected cars example, there's opportunities to see benefits with fleet, being able to failure and prediction, maintenance and alerts of just-in-time servicing. We see the appetite from the car dealerships in terms of being able to leverage vehicle telematics to alert dealers of real-time dynamic servicing, and suppliers maintaining just-in-time inventory levels, distribution centers, based on the real-time maintenance needs, just as examples. And some of the new models around commerce and trade, right? From the smart cities, in many cases, being able to understand the patterns, location, marketplace for target marketing promotions on behalf of their community, to direct retailers, where you're going to start seeing more in-car e-purchasing experiences for goods with pickup as you're driving home from work, for example. We're also seeing kind of the growth and opportunities of players like gas stations, where instead of going into a gas station, being able to look around, identify what are the possible gas stations, and potentially having a bid for your business and the best price coming up, maybe prepaying ahead, and you just drive in and fill up. So you start seeing these new demographics that are coming into that model. If we, and I'm going to kind of jump one of the supply chain models around that as well, from both the supplier and the OEM participants. If we kind of look at what that community, the value, we see that it really falls into a set of categories where really, if we look at the lowest value at the bottom left, and we start going upwards, we see the value with greater community participation. As we look at the value of it going right, we see the greater data volume. Just to kind of give you an idea, as you see that growth, when we look at smart cities, we see the volumes growing quicker than the participation, but actually starting to expand as you start getting the economy of scales. Compared to the connected car, where because there is an OEM driving it, we'll see a greater participation, but the level of data will start at certain standard models and start shifting and expanding to that. But really seeing that, end state shifting to the highest value model over time. So to kind of describe what we're seeing as some of those insights, I'm going to give you an example of where this comes into bear. And the example we're doing, it's like a vehicle collision, and trying to highlight it in the participants and where it actually kind of gets executed. So, in this example, we may have a scenario where the auto manufacturer, through the telematics arm, from the individual customers, individual cars, are pre-loading some information about the driver and passengers, not to be delivered unless there's an emergency. And in the case of an emergency, being able to send this off on a real-time basis to, for example, the emergency services within a city, to be able to have both the response of those emergency services, but also to preempt the hospitals to understand some information about the customers and be able to ramp that information. Examples like this where you do not want to expose the data except to a select group in this emergency situation, and you want that data to have a shelf life. So it may be set to 3 hours, so enough time for the emergency services and the hospitals to be able to have that initial reaction, and then have the data disappear at that point, where it would go into the traditional hospital systems the way they're working in that way. Where as you get past that, you start seeing, hopefully it wasn't a serious accident, but you get into the repair of the automotive and the insurance companies and the authorization of that repair. We start seeing that as we combine that, beyond the real-time interactions of those and the individual transactions, you start seeing benefits around the data insights beyond that. So as you start looking at the monetization of that information across a greater set, you see the automotive industries looking at the repair parts and opportunities. You look at the cities looking at the awareness of accidents and looking at how to best deploy their emergency services and locations of hospitals and others around that. You see that the aggregation of the data and the anonymization of it across a greater ecosystem has a lot of the value. And as we look at that, we see that the real value goes well beyond the traditional real-time IoT into this aggregated piece. As you've collected more of the information, and the distribution of that has greater value to the participants of it, and even more so as you get to that greater ecosystem. And you start applying the algorithms and machine learning to the models, you start seeing a greater value in that data across that system. Now, we're describing this as really, kind of a data exchange. This may transform into something that has commerce value associated to it based on who is asking for that. But what's amazing is that, as we look around the participants, each of those participants today is creating their own ecosystem. And yet they want to share in each other's ecosystem. And how do you do that when they really have been building their own platform? And really what we're seeing is the enabler is data. And we're seeing that it's being able to manage that decoupling model on behalf of the participants. As we kind of play a role, we're shifting from an industry-specific model to an ecosystem and functional-specific model, where we see participants from the service providers, the telecom providers, where in many cases they can leverage their network with these analytic solutions on top to provide these types of services to those ecosystems. As a trusted third party in that, in some cases sharing information where applicable, but in most cases being neutral to anything related to the data itself, but the facilitation. We see the automotive manufacturers, leveraging the telematics technology to go beyond what they do internally, which is, a very secure internal network of that information, to being able to have the API models to extend to that ecosystem, interact with their environment, interact with other participants in there, and get information from those other participants back. And we're really seeing, as these ecosystems are being built, they will, it'll have elements of how you track and audit that information through the full life cycle, whether you're tapping into blockchain for some of those models or leveraging some of the metadata management that we've been working with and the policy management around that. So when we look at the benefits of that, we see it's works really well with this rapidly evolving business models. It gives flexibility to be able to handle change, independent of how the starting point for the participants is. There is an ability to incorporate that level of integration. We see the ability to constantly evolve, knowing that these models will keep changing and varying. You don't need to build for an end state. You can build and expand as you move along there. And it creates really this trust within the community. So we're looking at models that not just have the sharing of data, but allowing the owners of their data to not just determine the policies and controls, but as you start applying blockchain and models for variation, being able to not just say, hey, we're supporting you. When you say trust me, we're also being able to show an audit of where that data's gone and how it's being used in that type of model. And so with that, Mike, I think I'm going to pass it on to you to kind of show how an example of how that would come into play.
Absolutely. So based on what Sanjay just talked about, you must be saying to yourself, whoa, sharing data across all these different ecosystems, well, aren't there data privacy issues? Aren't security, don't we have huge security concerns depending on who's in the system? Yeah, these are great questions. What I want to talk to you about, though, is how we could actually enable those types of controls within the data management platform. So, if we're talking about shared data in a community, right, this brings up a lot of scary questions. It's, for example, if you're going into a shared data set, you want to know who owns the data, where does the data come from, where is it going, how has the data changed, am I seeing the latest version of the data? In short, can I trust the data, right? And what we're going to talk to you about is that we actually have platforms evolving now. They're going to allow you to have confidence in this data. Because if we are talking about data communities, right, who's to say where that data came from and whether I can trust it? So we'll talk about that in a second. So what's kind of required? If we're looking at this connected community, we need to, first of all, have data access across the system. But that data access that's put into the system needs to be shared by the data owner, right? So if you look at each data provider will share data and say exactly who can use it. And we'll talk to you about it. We'll show you how we do that in a second. Again, we need to be able to control exactly and precisely who can see which data fields, for how long. You have to be able to have policies around that. You have to be able to audit that. Who's seen the data? What did they do to the data? How's the data changed, right? What's the latest version of the data? We need to be able to control each and every one of these aspects if we are going to exist within a community of data, right? And have community insights. If we don't have this underlying set of controls in the system, this is just never going to work. So how it works, and this is kind of interesting. Now we're starting to get where the rubber meets the road, right? Now we're going to start talking about systems and capabilities now, okay? So we've set kind of the context. We've got a world that's evolving. Everybody's saying data is the new oil. How do we monetize it? It's going to take a community to monetize it. How do we put the sufficient controls on the data so that we can trust it? So how it kind of works is that, as we said, we've got a connected community at the top, right? You've got data providers, you've got data end users. These communities will naturally grow and evolve around ecosystems of cars and cities and insurance providers, as you said earlier, right? So one of the capabilities that the Hortonworks side came up with, and there's similar capabilities on the Cloudera side, but something called Hortonworks Data Plane Service, and I'll explain to you what that is in a second. The key point that we want to bring out here in using a mechanism like Data Plane Service is that we're centralizing the management of key capabilities across clusters, right? Across data lake clusters and across, and each of those clusters are across the community. So what do we want to do? First of all, we recognize that there's going to be database clusters owned by different entities across ecosystems, right? So the first thing we need to be able to do is have an easy mechanism to register those clusters. Sign them up, right? And give visibility to them at the highest level, right? So now we're all working off kind of a common canvas, right? But that's just the very basic thing that we need to do. So we need visibility to the data, for one thing. But then we need to be able to have a common set of governance across it. And that governance has a few flavors to it. First of all, we need user and security management, right? So we have to have a centralized way to define users and their roles and privileges. So here the users registered into the system. Here are roles that we as a community have decided on, and here are the privileges that each one of those, the data privileges that each of those roles have, right? And we centralize that across the cluster. The third thing we need to be able to do is manage the data lifecycle. So we have to be able to track the lineage of that data. Where did the data come from? Where did it go from? How did it change within the system? We have to have that metadata management so that we can actually track this data across its lifecycle. Interesting, Sanjay mentioned it a little earlier, how does it interact with blockchain? Well, it might be that when data comes into the system, prior to being within this ecosystem, you want to snapshot that data and have a blockchain associated with that. That becomes the beginning point. It might be when you hand off that data, and people are going to be using it outside of the ecosystem. Particularly if you're going to monetize it, you might want to blockchain that as well, so that you know exactly what you gave out and becomes verifiable. So, key point is there's a set of capabilities where we can put some centralized governance and trust through these different layers into data that's ultimately distributed. And we'll talk about what that looks like now. So we're actually going to show you some screens that hopefully will cement this so that you could start to see what would this look like in a system. Okay, this is a capability called Hortonworks Data Plane Service that Hortonworks introduced in the last year, and it allows to do many of the things that we've talked about earlier. So let's just go through that. So this is a screen that we took. This is, imagine, as we said, we had various players within this new extended ecosystem, right? We had automakers, we had vehicle owners, we had telematics providers, insurance. Notice each one of them, you can register those clusters. And by the way, there's other ways. It doesn't have to be cluster-centric. That could be portals to be able to upload information if you had to. But this is a cluster-based kind of approach that we're demonstrating here. And you can see that different clusters in different parts of we can register those, whether they are on-premise clusters, whether they're clusters up in the cloud. That's one thing that we can, that this data fabric allows you to do, is to be able to provide visibility to these clusters no matter where they sit, right? Cloud, on-premise, whatever. They can be registered onto the canvas. Now, then there's this notion of data assets, and you can see that this notion of automaker data, vehicle owner data, and you can see there's an administrator associated with each of them. So if I'm an automaker, I can very precisely say, hey, here are the assets that I'm going to be providing, right? And likewise, the lease provider and the telematics provider, they'll have their day in the sun and their way to be able to provide the data assets that they want to as well. So, just drilling down a little further, let's just look at data that comes from the automakers, and we're going to call this asset collection vehicle accident data. I'm going to show you it's actually constituted by a few different tables. Right, so if you look at it, there's emergency contact information that the OEM is providing in here. So think about it, that's PII information. So alarm bells should start going off, whoa, there's contact information. Then there's information from a vehicle event, a table, for example. So when a car goes into an accident and an airbag gets deployed, there's an event there. Hey, what was the location of the vehicle? What were the parameters of the vehicle just before and just after the, right? You start to see these are all kind of information assets that the OEM says, you know what, as part of there's a community value here, perhaps monetization, perhaps just better citizen safety, whatever, but there's a use case associated with these data sets, right? So, and then, by the way, there's also one, if you notice, emergency incident analysis. That's a table, that's an aggregation table that we might want to give to the Department of Transportation down the road and give them access. But it's aggregated data. It doesn't have PII information. What type of accidents are we having under what types of conditions in certain city areas, right? All of these types of information assets could be very interesting to different people. Okay, but how do you now control who sees what within the community, right? If we drill down just into this emergency contact information, remember the alarm bells going off? We can see that here are all the different fields within that, and note we can tag each one of these ones. Right? So we can say, oh, okay, here's a name, and here's a social security number. We can tag that information, and tagging of it is only one important thing. We could then write security policies against this tag. So the next screen kind of shows you, now we could add security policies. So if we look at this is the OEM, remember the aggregation table? Where we said, hey, this is the aggregation table. So it would be, these are accidents that have happened and we might want to pass these off to cities. We could say, okay, for the city, we make this available, but you see the name? We can mask that field, right? And we can say, here are the roles who have access to that masked field. We can mask, for the social security number, we'll show only the first four, right? So you can see that in this mechanism, in this system, we can register the data from different clusters. We can let the users say which data they can choose what they put into asset collections, and then they can secure the data as needed by giving visibility to very specific visibility to users within the community based on role. Okay, the other thing, so we have table and field level controls that you see over here, right? And you can assign that to different users, right? So this is, for all your animals, and this is Ranger and Atlas type of capabilities, right? In terms of being able to provide this type of role-based access and tracking through metadata. So the next slide just shows you a little bit of the data lineage, right? So this is how we can actually show what happened to data, right? So the data came in from the OEM the owner portal. That's where I said, you know what, I'm opting in here. I'm opting into this emergency service. I'm going to put the name of myself and my loved ones and their contact information, because if they get into an accident, I want that data to be provided to the emergency responder people, right? So this is the data coming in from the OEM portal, and then there's data coming in from the vehicle event itself. So if we have an event, guess what? We're going to push that information over, and we're going to send that OEM emergency detail table, give that visibility to the emergency responder, right? And by the way, we'll give them time-based access to that. We'll give you access to it for 24 hours so that you can call the, you can call the ambulance. You can give them all of the blood type that was in the profile, the emergency. But then after that, you wipe it out, right? But then we can then take that emergency detail information and aggregate it for use for cities, for research. What kinds of accidents were people seeing in certain locations, in certain weather conditions? And we can do all that masking that we talked to you about earlier. So people will only see aggregation level detail. So, what we're doing is we're kind of building up this layer of saying, yep, we've got this mechanism to bring together different data sets from different entities. They can control what data they want in that community, who can see it, and track exactly how it was used. And we can track even a little bit further on. So we can say, okay, so this was the accident detail, right, for use by emergency dispatch, and this one for the aggregated detail. I keep forgetting I have builds here, which would have made it easier for you. But you get the idea, right? In terms of we can control the access of data across the data's lifecycle. And just a little bit more about audit trail. Look, you can say, look, this is what people who were coming into the record and looking, and guess what? They were blocked, or they were denied, or they were right. You can actually have very detailed data logging, in terms of audit trail, so that people can feel confident that they know what happened to that data. Right? It's secured. We saw how that data moved through the system. We know who ultimately saw it and whether they tried to do things, and there's full audit around here. So, event type, event time. So just kind of in conclusion, then we want to open this up to conversation. The key point here is that we're seeing that, people talk about data's the new oil, right? And we really believe that the trick to deriving value from data and perhaps monetizing it, or perhaps making our society better, is this notion of connected communities. And it's in the connected community context that data becomes valuable. This will drive what we'll call new data-driven business models. As Sanjay did a good job just kind of raising our awareness of some of the new potential models that might be coming down the pike. But to do so, right, trust in the data is paramount, right? And this is where I think the new capabilities that we've talked about, and I just kind of showed you through the screen, there are technologies available now that can provide that ability to bring together diverse data types, to put on the sufficient controls in a centralized way on decentralized data. And I think that's what's going to be really kind of the secret sauce that allows these new connected communities and use cases to grow. So this was meant to be a tease, because I think all of us are probably starting to think to ourselves, what are the possibilities of these new types of use cases? I think these use cases will be many. I think we're only just scratching the surface of introducing a few of them here. But clearly, I think a mechanism is needed to be able to establish trust within these communities, so we can enable these use cases. So with that being said, that's essentially what we wanted to present, but we'd love to get your feedback, any questions, comments. Does it make sense?
Any questions or any areas that you're seeing that appetite out there? And again, this is a new frontier, right? It really is kind of the Wild West of how it's being done. What we're really, proposing is a model that says even though there's different silos of actions that are being done, there's a common mechanism to be able to interact across there. And the creation of the community is really going to be driving ecosystems going forward, especially when they go beyond just one industry, but across functions across that industry. Any questions or comments there? Yes.
Any initiatives so far? Have you seen any different industries approach to you so far with that? Have you seen any
Yeah.
interest? I mean to say,
From other industries in that?
like, yeah, do you have any partners, for example, from automotive you mentioned?
Yeah, so for example, part of what we're talking about here are the discussions we're having with groups like.
Just repeat the question.
Yeah, just.
No, the question basically, I was wondering that how is the response to this approach, for example, from the industry, different part of the industry, different sector of interest? So what do you see is more interested, like
Yep.
automotive is more interested compared to telecom, or I don't know, medicine is more interested compared to energy,
Yeah.
something like that. What is the, in your experience, what do you see the immediate response coming? So who was, in your opinion, was really
Yeah.
Yep.
good at that?
Just repeat the question, then answer it, 'cause I
Okay,
think
so yeah, the question in terms of who were the industries that were looking as early adopters on this. So it's in many cases it is different ecosystems driven around certain industries. The industries, the automotive industry is pushing forward on this probably the quickest. From the nature of what they're doing in telematics and for the connected car. And that's kind of where we're doing work with groups like the Geneva Alliance, which is, kind of a body representing most of the automotive manufacturers and how they standardize on the telematics side. This is an area that has a keen interest from the telecom companies because in the end, they're in the best position to facilitate this on behalf of some of those ecosystems and leverage their network and in many cases, not just their next generation networks. These become the killer apps that can run on those next generation networks that are, recognizing not just the device, but authorization of who and what and where they're able to do it. In many cases, as an alternative to the internet. But we're also seeing, kind of a growth from smart cities. Pharmacy. Pharma have actually had a strong interest in that there's a natural fit within that environment. Not surprisingly, we're seeing the insurance companies interested in all those ecosystems because they have a kind of a key role on that front. But we're also seeing variations of this come with the industrial Internet of Things. So, we're seeing the energy sector, for example, where they're looking at better utilization of some of the sensor devices that they have and how they work with the manufacturers of those devices. So these new ecosystems are forming, but yeah, there's connected medical device is another area that we're seeing a lot of growth in, and again, driven by the carriers doing some of that information with health facilities on that front. But there's a differing growth based on different regions that are there, and but the appetite is definitely there for that right across the board. But to your point, the automotive industry is the most bullish on that front. Yeah.
Swiss Re has actually published some work that they've done with which is a Chinese insurance company, and there's other activity that is going on in Asia around the digital ecosystems. And there's one area right now that's called Grab. Grab is actually a ecosystem that is started within the life, the health, and there's also the car manufacturer. So these concepts are not just, hey, we're thinking about this in the future, they're actually starting to happen already.
Yeah.
Do you see some of the government intervening into it to monetize or regulate it?
Yes.
Their own data and how, do you see this kind of
So-
possibility of it or something?
Not so much the government, but this will have a commerce model around there. But the key is that the commerce model will not be a generic commerce model, right? It'll really be based on the value of the data. So for example, as you start looking across this, you'll see that researchers, they want the data, they don't have money to pay for the data, so there's a different kind of price model, or if there's any price model associated. And picking on Cindy and insurance, they're the ones in many cases that have the biggest value associated to some of the data and are more open to looking at those different price models. In terms of the government coming in, it depends on what the ecosystem's being driven around. So there is the thought around smart cities, for example, that may be one that the government's, they're stretching to determine. They know there's a lot of things they want to do. They're looking for where the revenue streams come from, and the only, so there is a risk that they'll have some component, but the only way that it'll really work is if there is business value that's come out of that scenario. And in many of those ecosystems, the government doesn't have control anyways on that. So.
Okay, I think we're getting the hook.
Okay.
So thank you guys for listening in. We appreciate it, and thanks for the great comments afterwards as well.